Hi, so I am Anna Ayala, and I'm here to give you your introductory tour of Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Just wanted to give you a little bit of information about him and some of his preoccupations and concerns about the society in which he lived. So let's get started. First things first, I want you to notice that there is a link here on this page to an actual article by Ruth Usoy from Yale University. This gives a lot more information about the particular novel that you might want to read. Who was Victor Hugo? Well, take a look at all of the different occupations this man had. He was always busy. He was constantly writing. He was constantly reading. He was producing poetry, 23 poems by the age of 14. He's also the author of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So if you know anything about that story, that's also a story that has to do with the rejected in society, which is very similar to what we see in Les Miserables. Things that he cared about. Well, he was very concerned about the idea of the death penalty and about the way that criminals were treated in prison. He would be of the sort that would believe that prison is not just for punishment. It's also supposed to be for reforming a person. It shouldn't be that you go to prison and then become a criminal because the conditions are so poor that you don't really have any other choice as to a way to live. And it shouldn't be that for condemnation of doing one thing, that it provides you with condemnation your entire life. He believed that criminals were still people and should be treated as human beings. And he didn't think that really the executioner should really be the person who orders society, who puts things to rights. It shouldn't be the executioner's job to do that. Instead, it should be the government and legislature's job to make sure that the conditions are such that criminality is lessened, not just to punish criminality and use punishment as a way of ordering society. So he was very concerned, especially about what was going on with the treatment of women and children, because he felt that these were the most vulnerable people in society and deserved the most protection, and yet it seemed like society was doing nothing to protect these two minority groups. So what was happening in society during the time? Well, you'll be hearing later from me about the French Revolution and the restorations after the French Revolution to find out what was going on in society. But one of the things you need to know is that the setting begins around 1815 and ends around 1833. There was a huge difference in status between a group called the bourgeoisie, who were attempting to become aristocrats. See, one of the things you need to know about the society is that it used to be that you were born into aristocracy, and based on your birth, you were allowed to have certain privileges when it came to the king and the way that the king ruled. But after the French Revolution, things began to change, and soon it became to the point where you could, by nature of your wealth and by nature of your ability to raise yourself, as a merchant, for example, then you could potentially enter the bourgeoisie, which is similar to the aristocracy in that you can also earn yourself specific privileges. So because they were trying to rise in society, they wanted to disassociate themselves from the lower class, and as a result, they, rather than being the major charitable contributions that were taking place to help the poor, to help the needy, which is usually the case with the middle class, instead, they treated the lower classes with contempt. So here you have the upper classes clearly not caring about the lower classes, and now you have the rising middle class also wanting to disassociate themselves from the lower classes. So there was nobody there to care, to give charitable contributions, to help the lower classes rise from their current situation. And as a result of poverty, criminal activities such as theft began to take place, as well as other things. When it got to the point where you had no hope as to where you're going to get your next loaf of bread, for example, sometimes thievery was common, other things were common in terms of crime, and this is also where perhaps we get some of our stereotypes of poor people also always being dangerous criminals. Many times poverty does end up result in criminal behavior because the conditions are such that it becomes this endless cycle of lack of resources. So the same went into play for prostitution. Sometimes women were at the end of the rope. They had no choice but to enter into prostitution in order to somehow survive. Children many times were abandoned or orphaned. People would abuse them without having any kind of punishment or control whatsoever. So there was nobody to protect these particular members of society. And Victor Hugo felt this was really wrong in his world, and he wanted to draw people's awareness to their lack of compassion and their lack of ability to think outside the box. Keep in mind that this is also imbued with lots of religious imagery. Victor Hugo was to a certain degree religious, and he really wanted to paint this type of self-sacrifice as the way of salvation kind of idea. He felt that this was really important to understand, because if we aren't being self-sacrificial in life, then he didn't feel like people were really being Christ-like. But he also was very critical of the Roman Catholic Church at the time, and part of this has to do with history and the Roman Catholic Church's involvement with the government, which is another story. But he didn't necessarily feel that the law as given by the Roman Catholic Church was really the way that things should be. He didn't feel it was that ecclesiastical law, meaning church law, that should dictate what is moral or not moral. He really felt instead that is really about tapping into the purpose of Christ's life, and to also be able to be capable of compassion and self-sacrifice in your daily acts, and daily try to just live a good life, and then little by little kind of work your way towards salvation, as opposed to just obeying a bunch of laws, attending ceremonies, or things of that nature. So there is a bit of religious purpose. You need to be aware of this going in, but it also has a highly social and moral purpose. It wasn't just about, hi, let me tell you how much I love the Roman Catholic Church, as we saw that he felt there were some major flaws in the Roman Catholic Church at the time. While he did believe that in a religious God, he also felt that there's a social moral purpose to this. He describes the social situation as a hell on earth, and he believed and suggests that heaven and hell can very much be experienced in our daily lives, and it depends on how we treat each other and how we choose to live our lives that create this hell on earth or heaven on earth for other people. So it's more of a moral and a social moral novel of self-sacrificing compassion toward others. Why does that matter to us? Well, just because it happened during a certain time period in France doesn't mean that we're not still in the same boat. We many times still deal with these same issues about what to do with poverty. We still have the death penalty. People still argue over whether or not that's appropriate or not. We wonder about human rights for prostitutes and how prostitutes should be treated in a society, if it should be legal or illegal, and what kinds of rights do they have as human beings. We worry about human rights in terms of how women and children are treated across the globe. So these are still things that we deal with today, and these are still areas that are issues here in Panama today. And one of the things I hope that we'll be able to do within the course of this unit is to hear from local people about things that they do in order to combat some of these major social problems and to help people develop a moral sensitivity to them. This is also where we get our CAS projects from, and the concept of CAS projects, the idea of social conscience toward those who are maybe rejected by society. Some things to expect from Les Miserables. It's not a perfect text. Don't expect it to be. There's a couple of things that you need to know as you're reading, and just get ready for it. It's a little bit of a cross between a telenovela and the movie Catch Me If You Can, and it's also an editorial on social issues. It's a telenovela because there's always somebody crying or having some sort of huge drama situation. And if you've ever watched some of those on television, Spanish and Latin American telenovelas, there's always somebody in like the worst possible situation who's completely desperate and helpless. There's horrible, awful villains. It's very clear who the villains are. It's very clear who the good people are. There's little twists and turns along the way. Catch Me If You Can, it's because you also have Jean Valjean, who's the main character, who is a criminal, but he's a likable criminal, and he's being chased by a cop, similar to how Leonardo DiCaprio's character in the film is being chased by Tom Hanks's character. So there's that little like, will the policeman catch up with him? Will he not? What will happen if he does? And certainly there's some interesting drama to be had with that. It's also an editorial on social issues because Victor Hugo is always concerned about what's happening in society, and many times he will go off and stand on a soapbox and tell you this is what's exactly wrong with our society and this is how we should change it, and this is why this part of the book is an illustration of that. So many times he'll tell you straight away exactly how you ought to interpret a certain event and what you're supposed to get out of it. There's also some repetitive imagery and some cliched phrases, so be aware that not everything is going to be maybe like contemporary literature today. This is not necessarily a contemporary novel, so certain conventions are going to be different. It was also initially meant to be a romance where you're supposed to have these exaggerated emotional reactions and melodrama, and all of that was supposed to be common. This was meant for the popular people to read. This wasn't just a highbrow work of literature for only the elite to read. So keep that in mind. This was supposed to emotionally touch people and change them emotionally toward feeling compassion for the lower ends of society. So to that end, he tries to tug on as many sentimental heartstrings as possible. However, there are plenty of things in a literary sense that can be appreciated. And one of your essential questions for this unit is, how can a cultural, historical, societal context affect the reader's experience or affect the purpose and the meaning that a writer's trying to give? And this is really why Les Miserables has existed to this day. His interpretation of history is based on the personal, his own personal interaction with it, the political, what's happening in politics during his time, as well as religious. But he also felt that there was a lot to be had in terms of how we ought to interact with society. And so the value is that, here's where I highlighted, he saw that God was not above the people in a clear, pure heaven, like looking down on us like, oh, look at all these dirty people. Nor was he in the golden royalty of the tyrannical leaders. It wasn't only the king who had access to God, for example. And as we know about absolute monarchies, that was what was preached before then. Instead, he saw God in the lowest parts of society, in the mire of the sewers and in the poverty of Gavroche, who's a street urchin or an orphan that is roaming the streets. And he really felt like, you know what, the attitude of who God is really in these people who are in the lowest ends of society. And that's where it starts to get really interesting, because he feels that salvation comes from below, not from above per se. So that's the end of that. I hope this helps you as you are reading the text. Have a great time. Bye.